Thank you. So we have Karine Brown with us today, very webinar, but Becca Schwartz from Jewish Social Services was going to ask her to talk briefly about what's going on with refugee resettlement, maybe especially with the new federal administration. We're not really going to take questions on this right now. Maybe at the end, we can throw some out there because I want to move on to our topic for today. But Becca, can you just take a few minutes to inform us?
Sure. Hello, everyone. It's been an interesting couple of weeks in refugee resettlement, and I'll try to make it quick. So last Friday, actually like a week and a half ago, the Biden administration came out saying that they were going to do away with the allocations, some say discriminatory allocations of the groups who were allowed to be coming here and resettling in the United States, but that they would be keeping the ceiling, the limit at 15,000. That was met apparently with very swift action. I'm not exactly sure by who, but I think that, several Congress people and senators and lots of other people made it. So the Biden administration then, by the end of the day, turned around and said that they would be planning to increase the limit and that increase would be announced in mid-May at some point. So that all happened. We actually made an appearance on, one of our clients made an appearance on Last Week Tonight with John Oliver, which happened right before all of this happened, to try to start putting pressure. I'm not saying that it's related, though it may be. We'll see. We won't see, never mind. Yeah. But I will, I'll put the link in the chat to this video. It is pretty astonishing how right he gets it. And it is not safe for work. So lots of not nice language, so be aware. And I'm happy to answer questions afterwards.
Thank you so much, Becca, and really looking forward to the adult video. Would you give me host rights back? I accidentally gave them to you. And yeah, it'd be great if we could any questions for Becca later. We can all be engaged about that. Karine Brown, we have Brown. And she began her career as a coordinator of international student admissions at the Milwaukee School of Engineering. Afterwards, she was, worked for the international admissions for DePaul University in Chicago, eventually became director there of international. After leaving academia, she founded One Earth International Credential Evaluations in Madison, Wisconsin. Karine evaluates tens of thousands of international academic credentials from more than 150 countries and enjoys learning something new every day, which with that kind of job, that kind of work and all those different countries, I can imagine learning quite a bit every day. When I started to do work with students with refugee background, learning about their experiences, this kind of problem of getting recognition for your past credentials, your past educational credentials came up time and again. And Karin was one person who I reached out to for advice, and I myself learned a lot from her knowledge and experience. And that's what we're going to get to do today, is learn from that. So all that said, really looking forward to this. Karin, would you mind just kind of giving us any more about your background and what you do at One Earth Evaluations?
Yes, of course. Thank you. Thanks, Matt, for having me. Thanks, Amy, for all the tech support, and thanks to all of the previous presenters that were part of this webinar. It's been a really fantastic series. So thanks for inviting me to be a part of it. So as Matt said, my background is in higher ed. I was in international admissions for many years. And in those roles, the credential evaluation was, of course, part of it. But, you know, as anyone who is in higher ed knows, you wear many different hats. So I did a lot of recruitment, admission, I-20 issuance. I even, you know, helped people move into the dorms sometimes, you know, like they just did a lot. And so even though my work now is it's complex and it's interesting, but it's sort of digging down deep into this one thing, which I really enjoy. And since starting One Earth and moving to Madison and doing just the credential evaluation piece, I've actually had the chance to work with an even broader range of applicants, and it's been really interesting work. I've seen credentials from places, you know, I tend to see the same ones over and over again, or I did when I was working in higher ed, a lot of India, a lot of China. When I was at the Milwaukee School of Engineering, it was a lot of Saudi Arabia. And I've, in working here in Madison with populations that not only are seeking further education, but also potentially licensure, like CPA or teaching licensure or employment. It's been a much wider variety. And I usually, well, I don't learn something new every day, but I'd like to, but nearly every day. And in fact, in almost 20 years of doing this, I just had a credential come across my desk this week from a country that I've never evaluated. It was the Federated States of Micronesia. And so we have a student in Madison who is from Micronesia. So who knew? Anyway, so what I do at One Earth is, my mission, our purpose is to empower and expand opportunities for those educated outside of the US. And so we work with any student or any individual who has been educated outside of the US who is seeking further education, employment, or licensure in the US. So essentially that's what we do. This subject is very close to my heart, both personally and professionally. I did a master's program at DePaul. It was an integrated interdisciplinary master's program. And so I combined education, psychology, international studies, and I wrote my master's thesis on Sudanese refugees resettled in Lincoln, Nebraska. And I spent some time in Syria before the war. And so, you know, it's always been an area close to my heart as well. So I am happy to be here and share whatever knowledge and information I have to help reduce the barriers to admission and to employment for this population of students.
That's wonderful. So my first question, I guess there's kind of two, and you have some slides that, so the slides are going to be available. We'll make the video available as well as the slides. There's some good resources in the slides as well, I know. So those will be made available. Also, I don't know if I announced, everyone, please put questions into the chat. I'm going to try and keep an eye on that, and we'll pause, you know, whenever we can to take questions. So go ahead and do that as we go. And then it's kind of a big question, but I was hoping you could take us through kind of the steps of credential evaluation, the sort of special situations of helping students with refugee background, and then this issue which you already brought up of barriers. What are they, and how can they be removed? So that's a big bundle of questions, but you know, take us through what you can, your slides, or you know, yeah, and we'll just keep interacting.
I'll go ahead and start the screen sharing because I think I can sort of dive right into that. And you're right. I mean, I give full day workshops on, you know, credential evaluation. So I won't go into the details of it, but just for the purpose of, you know, for those of you that aren't as familiar with the process of international credential evaluation, I'll just briefly, you know, kind of talk about what it is, why it's done, and how it's done. So I just have a few slides on that before we get to the sort of specific challenges related to refugees. So is everyone seeing the
It looks good.
screen? Okay. All right, good. Okay. All right. Okay, so international credential evaluation. It is the conversion of one system of education to the US equivalent. So unlike a translation, which is a language translation, so translating from one language into English or from one language to another, this is an analysis based on comparative education. And it essentially allows for fair and consistent consideration for all students. So it converts the students' system of education, the recognition of the institution they attended, the level of study, their credits and grades, and then sort of the qualification that they received, what is it equivalent or most comparable to in the US. And that allows anyone in admissions office at a university, or for instance, an employer who, if the job requires a minimum of a bachelor's degree for the job, for instance, it shows what that person's qualifications are equivalent to in the US. So that's essentially what it is. And why it's done, it may seem obvious, but maybe not. So how many countries? There's what, depending on who you ask, 200 odd countries in the world. And it's thankfully there's not 200 different systems of education in the world, but there's enough to keep it interesting. In some other countries, students end secondary school or high school in grade 10. So essentially they're 15 or 16. This was the case in the Philippines years ago. They've now added an 11th and then now a 12th year. But older Philippines credential students end high school in grade 10. Iceland has a 14-year system of primary and secondary education. So, it's not the same as the US, 12 years. There's also, in most other countries, certain streams that students will go into right away in secondary school, and that's different than the US, which is sort of just a general high school diploma. So they'll choose either humanities, math, science. They'll either choose, or sometimes others will choose for them, depending on what's needed in the country or region as far as job, or depending on their examination results, like what kind of student they are. And most systems of education outside of the US at the secondary level have some sort of external exam that's required to obtain that credential. So, they'll go to high school or secondary school, and then it's not that their high school transcripts don't matter, they do. It's sort of but it's a means to an end. Really, that the only credential that is that sort of ticket into the next level of study are these examinations that are usually administered by either an exam board or the Ministry of Education in that country. So that's different than the US. Where we just would have, sort of 3 or 4 years of high school transcripts. And then if you get a certain, 2.0 minimum and you get the credits required, then you get your high school diploma. At the university level, university degrees, first university degrees can be anywhere between 2 years and 5 years. Pakistan is a classic example of a 2-year bachelor's degree. And usually the thing that's, quote, missing from degrees outside of the US is that liberal studies or general education component. That's sort of a tenet of the US philosophy, the US system of education, to have that the liberal studies or that general education component. And a lot of other countries just sort of get right to it. If you're studying commerce, that's what you take, and they don't take much else. So those are some differences. One of the big differences that can be a challenge when evaluating credentials is that professional programs like medicine, veterinary medicine, dentistry, law, those usually start immediately after secondary school, after high school. So someone, may have a bachelor of dental surgery, and it doesn't exist here. There's just no such thing as a bachelor of medicine or a bachelor of surgery or a bachelor of law. So those can be a little bit challenging because they can sort of fall into a little bit of a gray area, where they're not technically there's a bachelor's degree because there's no such thing in the US, but they're a first university degree, and they give access to the profession in that person's home country. And they're usually quite a bit longer than 4 years, so they're even more than a bachelor's degree. And then, of course, there's a wide variety of credits and grades, so when determining, the transfer credit for someone who's coming in with undergraduate study, or determining GPA, and that's what we do, is to convert the credits and grades. And the questions that we ask when doing this, it's more complicated than just sort of 5 questions, but essentially, distilling it down into what it is that we do. We first determine if the credential is recognized by the appropriate authority in that country to oversee education and issue qualifications. At the university level, a good example of this would be, does it have the equivalent to US regional academic accreditation? And that's usually something that is overseen by the Ministry of Education, or Higher Education Commission, or someone in that country. At the secondary level, usually schools are overseen by a Ministry of Education, Youth and Sports, or Ministry of Education somehow, or as I mentioned, those exam boards for secondary education. So there's some sort of proper authority to issue that document. What's the level of education and the role in the country? So is the credential a secondary credential, equivalent to our high school? Is it post-secondary? And if so, is it equivalent to a 4-year bachelor's degree in the US? And then what is the intent of that program? So is it academic? Is it vocational? What can students do with that credential in their home country? Can they go on to further education, in which case it's an academic credential, or would the credential only give access to employment? So one of the things that, did I see the page? Yes, I don't think I said this one, sorry. Okay, the admissions requirements, if it is a academic credential, what is required to get into that program? So if the requirements for a program, for instance, are that the student has to finish secondary school and have that secondary school credential in order to get in, then we can sort of firmly place it in post-secondary or undergraduate. What's the length of study? If it's a 2-year bachelor's degree from Pakistan, even though they call it a bachelor's degree, would we call it a bachelor's degree? And the answer is no. And then, as I mentioned, what can the student do in their home country with that credential? Nursing can be a tricky one with this, because a lot of nursing programs outside of the US are hospital-based nursing programs, and they're intended for employment only. And so sometimes we need to ask a trusted resource in that country, because this information is not readily available on that transcript or on that qualification. But we'll ask, if a student were to use this credential to apply to a bachelor's degree. So, for instance, a BSN in the US, in their home country, would they be awarded advanced standing credit for this, or would they have to start from scratch? So that kind of helps guide us what we would do with it here. We try to be fair and consistent, and think about what can be done with that credential in the home country, and give students that same opportunity here. But of course, if it's a nursing credential that's a secondary vocational credential in Russia, we wouldn't want to give them like 3 years of undergraduate study here, because that wouldn't be fair either. And then, as I said, the ultimate question is, what is it equivalent to in the US? And I put equivalent in quotes because it's often like, apples and oranges, like round peg, square hole kind of situation. It's not always equivalent. So I think comparable is the better word. So what is the qualification comparable to in the US? What we're really looking for is what we call a benchmark credential. So a benchmark credential is the academic award marking the point of transition from one level of education to the next higher level. So, after secondary school, we get a high school diploma. After undergraduate, we get a bachelor's degree. and other countries have those same type of benchmark credentials. They may not always be called the same thing, but essentially they're, that sort of document, that qualification that gives them access to the next higher level. Any questions?
I was just wondering, this is probably a big question, but just generally, like, do the post-colonial educational systems, do they relate in majority to like the colonizing nation?
Yeah.
Is that a general thing?
Yeah, for the most part. Yeah, and as I said, there are not 200 different systems of education. Many of them can be categorized under, there's 4 major ones actually. There's the US-based, kind of systems, Russian-based systems, and then French and British. And so, the Francophone Africa is under the French system. You'll see the same, their secondary credential is called the baccalaureate, their first university degree is called the licence, and it's the same as in France, The UK, they have, it's structured much the same way. And you'll see that from, so there's a lot of sort of politics and history and culture.
Sure, it's very interesting to learn about. I'm just curious, like, you're kind of it's almost like you're describing like detective work, trying to figure out how these things coordinate. And as an evaluator, how much kind of leeway do you have in making those characterizations? Like, it seems as if in some cases it's like, oh, that's clear. And in other cases, like you said, round peg, square hole, but, is it fair kind of thing? Like, how much leeway do you have as a evaluator?
Yeah, it's interesting because there's no, unlike Europe or Canada or other places where there's sort of a centralized governmental organization that does this work, this is very autonomous. There's independent credential evaluation agencies like myself. There are credential evaluators within universities, within, law firms and businesses. And so, it is a little bit of a judgment, a professional judgment. And there are professional organizations, that we belong to, we as credential evaluators, that help to set the methodology and their practices to follow. There's resources that we use, sort of collectively and individually to come up with the degree equivalencies, for lack of a better word, and grade conversions. But sometimes it is a little bit of a judgment call, and 2 evaluators may come up with different assessments, and that's just how it is. That's part of it.
Okay. Well, I just want to remind everybody, please put questions in the chat as they come up. But this, Karin, go ahead. This looks like a credential or something.
Yeah, this is an example credential, one that I actually just did last month. So this is an example of a general evaluation. So there's usually 2 types of evaluation reports that are offered. I'll just speak for my company, for One Earth. There's a general evaluation, and this is an example of that. And that will list the name of institution, country of education, level of study, duration of program, the name of the credential received in the home country, what is equivalent to in the US, and the US grade equivalent. And it just gives a summary. So essentially it's kind of a document to document evaluation, which shows the degree equivalence and overall grade point average. And that's typically required for students that just have secondary credentials, because there's no post-secondary college or university credit to transfer. Usually for secondary school, just having that degree equivalence is fine. So this was a student from Iraq, and he was lucky to have his original document with him. So he sent it to me. I actually also verified this through the, and I'm just blanking on what it is. It's an organization in Washington, DC that I'll think of it and let you know if you're interested in a good verification resource for Iraqi credentials. But I looked at other examples of Saudi Iraqi secondary school certificates that I had on file. And I noticed that there was a hologram missing that is usually on it, and that there is only one signature instead of two. So just as a precaution, I did send it for verification and was pleased to get a response back. It took about a month, but they responded and said that it was authentic. So this student was able to, now has this evaluation report that confirms that he has the equivalent to a U.S. high school diploma, and further that his credentials that he has from Iraq are verified, that they've been verified as authentic. So he's attending Houston Community College right now, and I hope he's doing well.
Yeah.
This is an example of a course-by-course evaluation. So this is, I didn't include both pages. There's a summary at the end, just like the other general evaluation. But you can see the difference in this one is that the student has a 4-year bachelor's degree and has obtained a course-by-course evaluation. So this lists out all of the courses that the student took at the undergraduate level and the US equivalent credit and grade. So, she's hoping to use this for Madison College to transfer some of her coursework that she already took to her new program. And that's something I think that's really important. Because what I tell students when they talk with me or meet with me is that my job is to make sure your education counts, that you don't have to start over. And I think, one of the accessibility challenges that I sort of outline here is the assumption that their education won't count. I've had students say, well, I did a communications degree, so, and I want to do something different. So nobody's going to care about that. I had a woman who had essentially the equivalent of a master's degree, and she was, working at a low-paying job and was really frustrated and wanted to go back to school. And she was at first planning to take the GED, and I was like, why would you take the GED if you have a master's degree? And then, she's like, well, I didn't think that anything would count because I want to do something different. And so, the idea that, thinking about how much a course credit costs and how much time, and these are students who are usually very highly educated, who have spent, sometimes 5 years at university. Like, even if they can transfer a handful of classes, it will save them thousands of dollars and months of time. And usually there's something that can transfer, mathematics class or a science class or, elective somehow, right? So it's always, if someone has something to show, some sort of credential, it's usually going to be in their best interest to try to get it evaluated and try to use that. So I think that's something that's really important when talking with students and with community stakeholders too, is that, taking the GED, it's perfectly fine if that's what they need to do, but it can be a barrier that's unnecessary. If they already have a high school diploma or more from their home country, there's no need to have to do that. So,
But Becca, did you?
Yeah, we have a question from the Q&A section from Caitlin Mackesy. Can experience working in the field, for example, for nursing or engineering, contribute to the judgment calls?
That's a really good question. So there are evaluators that do that evaluate based on professional qualifications or work experience, and I'm not one of them. My purview is really limited to academic credentials. So I don't make the judgment call of whether someone's work experience or licensure in their home country. I don't do an evaluation based on that. I just do the academic credentials, but certainly, when asked, I always encourage students to give that information to the school or the employer, because I know that institutions can consider things like credit for prior learning or work experience, or certainly if they're pursuing licensure here, having licensure in their home country may make a difference. So yes, it should count, and it does. I don't quantify that, into the evaluation report. So I only do the academic part of it. Okay.
There are also a couple of questions in the chat. Do you want to finish this slide first, though?
No, go ahead. That's fine.
Okay. If there's room for judgment and this is from Christina Smith.
Mm-hmm.
If there's room for judgment and the possibility of different conclusions, do you ever worry about the risk of some agencies capitalizing on this idea of leniency in order to attract more business?
That's a good question. I would like to think that wouldn't happen. I'm sort of Pollyanna. I like to see the good, the good in people. But yes, potentially. I think that it could, and I've seen it firsthand. I know that some people evaluation shop, right? Or that there's, chats and people. There's chatter about I have a 3-year degree from India. Which evaluation company will equate this to a bachelor's degree and which one won't, and then, they'll sort of go to the one that's more favorable, right? I think that can pose a challenge ultimately, especially for institutions that outsource the evaluation process to an external evaluation agency and rely on those evaluation reports to make their admission decision. I think it can be a challenge because conceivably they could get an evaluation for one student that says this 3-year degree is equivalent to a bachelor's degree. And they could get another evaluation from another agency that says for the exact same credential, this is equivalent to 3 years of undergraduate study. So I think, it's important for institutions or anyone who is using credential evaluation companies to do their due diligence and to vet them and find out what their policies are and what their methodology is, and make sure that it's in line with your own institutional policy and philosophy. But I will also say that an evaluation report is not an admission decision. It's not a decision of employment. It's not a license. It is simply advisory. So you can take my evaluation and do with it what you will. So ultimately the decision rests with the employer or the institution, the admissions office. I'm not making an admission decision. So there are plenty of schools that, if I say this 3-year degree from India is equivalent to 3 years of undergraduate study, they will make the assessment that yes, but we believe the student has the qualifications to be successful in this graduate program, and we're going to admit them, and that's perfectly fine. So maybe that's a longer answer than what you were looking for, but yes, it can cause issues. But ultimately, if you know what your policy is and use the evaluations as a guide and not as an admission decision, and that you're applying your own, there's more than goes into it than just counting years and calculating GPA, right? There's tests, there's personal statements and essays, there's the subject that the student took, there's the work experience they might have, there's so much more. It's much more nuanced decision than what we as credential evaluators do, which is just very much sort of converting the credential.
Yeah. Okay. There's a couple more questions in the chat. Bethany Goose says, I've heard that it's often difficult for immigrants or refugees who studied medicine before coming to the US. Is this true? Mm-hmm. Do they often have to redo many years of school?
So I believe it is true. And just sort of anecdotally, I've worked with a lot of doctors who go back to school in some sort of medical field, but not necessarily to be a doctor here. And I think that the barrier comes not necessarily with recognizing their education, but passing the boards and going through the other steps that are required to be a licensed physician here. So I think that those are the sort of higher level barriers that arise. I think sometimes it can be challenging, if an institution has sort of and I don't want to say narrow, but maybe a limited definition of what's required for a graduate program, for instance, and it says, they have to have a bachelor's degree. And if the evaluation report says the student has a first professional degree in medicine, it's not a US bachelor in medicine because there just doesn't anything that exists. They may deny that student and say, you can't, you have to have a bachelor's degree. So, this is where I have a conversation sort of follow up and say, but it's more than a bachelor's degree. They're very qualified for your program. But yes, it can be a challenge, definitely.
There are a couple more questions. Do you want to keep going with the questions or?
We can, use your judgment. I can't see them. So if you think they're pertinent to the credential evaluation process. Otherwise, I'm going to go a little bit more into sort of the specific documentation challenges for refugees.
Why don't we hold on a couple of the questions,
Okay.
Becca? And I would love if we could dig into some of these, like the documents and the process and the barriers, and then probably some of those questions will be addressed, and then we can pick it up later.
Okay, sounds good. I'm going to be mindful of time. So I feel like I'm having too much. Okay, so of course, there's language proficiency issues, lack of information on how to access opportunities, costs that might be involved, fees for translation, evaluation, applications, not to mention the fee of university, tuition, right, or college tuition. A lot of applicants need to work and don't have time, or take care of family and don't have time. So these are all very real barriers and real challenges. But one that I will sort of dive a little bit deeper into is the insufficient or lack of documentation. And I think this is something that's it's not completely unique to refugees, but I think that it is much more so than the general population of students coming in. And there are various reasons why that might be. I think these are the four sort of most common. Interrupted periods of education. Students might have incomplete credentials. They might have had to pause their education and resume at a later date in a different place. They might not have that benchmark credential. They might have attended a refugee school or a school that was set up by UNHCR or an interim government school, and that may not be recognized in the way that we sort of define it by the Ministry of Education recognizes the qualification. They might only have unofficial documentation, a poor quality scan or a photocopy, or something that is not very high quality, and we may or may not be able to verify the document depending on if the school still exists, what the circumstances are, and then sometimes there's no proof of educational achievement. They just don't have anything with them, and they're not able to get anything. So one example that I mentioned, the interim government, this is kind of an interesting case. And this is evolving all the time. So I hope that this is relevant information. Or most recent information. I tried to find the most recent information because I know that things are changing a lot with this. But so because of the civil war in Syria, there's essentially two governments that SAR, the Syrian Arab Republic, led by President Assad, and then the Syrian interim government, SIG. And in 2013, or since 2013, the Syrian interim government revised the curriculum for what the Syrian end credential is called the baccalaureate diploma. And it's administered in Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon, and parts of Syria. And the problem with these is that the SIG diplomas are not recognized by the Syrian Arab Republic's Ministry of Education. And if a student were to come back to Syria and try to gain admission to university, they wouldn't be allowed to do so based on the SIG diploma. It's not recognized. It is recognized, however, in other countries, and other countries are recognizing that this is, even though it's technically an unrecognized qualification, obviously circumstances are such that this can be considered a benchmark credential and lead to admission to further education. So until 2019, I believe it was only Turkey and parts of France that recognized the SIG baccalaureate. But now it's recognized by several European universities in the UK, Germany, and Sweden. And I'm sure elsewhere, I just don't have the data, the statistical data on where it's recognized. This one, I would just like to quickly thank my colleagues at ECRO and ECE for this example credential, because this was not one of mine, but this is one of my colleagues. This is another one that sort of falls in the gray area, kind of falls in between the cracks. This university was funded by the UNHCR specifically for Afghan refugees in Pakistan. And, unfortunately, it's not authorized by the Higher Education Commission in Pakistan as a degree granting institution, nor is it recognized by the Ministry of Higher Education in Afghanistan. So, it's sort of one of the only opportunities, or it has been, for Afghan refugees in Pakistan to further their education, but it doesn't have the proper degree granting authority by the powers that be in either country. So, in this one, I was telling Matt just before we came on that I was really fortunate to have met a student yesterday from Eritrea. And so I should also say that I don't always know, I don't often know whether a student is or was a refugee or what their status is, because their immigration status or lack thereof has no bearing on their credential evaluation, unless there's an issue, with the documentation and need to dig deeper or find out their story, right? But it's not something I ask on the application. So I just happen to know that this student, she's no longer in refugee status, but she fled Eritrea 15 years ago and submitted this document on the left, which looks very much like a complete high school transcript. It has 4 years of study. It has the courses she took. It has the grades she received. But the problem is that this is not the benchmark credential in Eritrea. So back a few slides when we talked about, what that credential is that gives access to further education in the home country, the document that is needed is the one on the right. So the Ministry of Education awards the Eritrean Secondary Education Certificate, and this is that benchmark credential. So she said that she took this exam, but she does not have the results with her and has no family back home that can get them and doesn't know what to do. So if anyone is on the call from MATC, I will be contacting you about the student because she is applying to MATC. So this is one of those situations where we have an incomplete set of credentials and, we just have to have a conversation, right? And so I had her fill out an affidavit, sort of a statement that lists kind of her educational history and the circumstances around which she was not able to obtain or bring with this credential, but sort of saying, yes, I did do this exam, and this is the year I did the exam, I just don't have it with me. So I'm going to try to contact the Ministry of Education in Eritrea and see if they have a record from 2008 or whenever this was of her taking this exam. And I'm not optimistic, but it never hurts to try, right? So this hopefully won't be a barrier to her admission if we can have a conversation about it. But it's, it's sort of a little bit of a leap of faith sometimes, you just have to take students' words for it, that they did this, that they have it, and that they're eligible for education here. I really want to be mindful of time, so I'm not going to go into each of these in detail because you'll have the slides and you can click on them yourselves, but these are some really great resources. Certainly not comprehensive. I mean, there's a ton out there. And, the work that Matt's doing is one of them that should be out there. But since you all know about the work that he's doing, or hopefully you do, that can be, that's in your pocket already. But these are just some, different resources. Some of them are kind of a practical guide to helping refugees, kind of a step-by-step process. The one that I'd like to point out are the two that I think are really interesting. The University Alliance for Refugee and At-Risk Migrants, the UARM, It's a fantastic organization, and it'd be worth looking into a little bit, the work that they're doing. And then the other one here at the bottom, I think, is also really interesting, this Article 26 backpack. And it's named after Article 26 of the Declaration of Human Rights, that asserts the right to education for all people. And it's kind of a cloud-based ecosystem, is what they call it. And it allows for refugees and displaced persons and those in refugee-like situations to create sort of a digital backpack of their documents and to house it in this kind of digital way that can be shared with universities or employers or whoever needs it. And they have something interesting that's called My Story, My Future, and it's an oral personal statement. So you can actually upload a video of your personal statement, and it just puts a personal touch on things, and it allows students to tell their story. I always like to say that, I think of these students as more than just, grades on a piece of paper, right? Like there's a human behind each of those pieces of paper, and it's really nice to be able to see the big picture, and to remember that. So.
That's wonderful. Sorry.
Yeah.
Should we pose for questions now, or do you want to?
Yeah.
Are we a good spot?
Well, let me just really quick. This one, because I know we're almost done. I think I have 2 more slides, maybe not even.
Okay. You want to finish?
This one is kind of so the Europeans are. We look to to Europe because they are sort of much more advanced in setting policy, and I think partly because of the volume of refugees they get, but also because they have sort of a centralized government-funded entities that do this work. So ENIC, NERIC. ENIC is the European Network of Information Centers, and NERIC is the National Academic Recognition Information Centers. So, there are 34 different countries in Europe that belong to this ENIC, NERIC network, and their job is essentially to recognize academic qualifications at the national level. So for anyone that comes into that country, whether for further education, employment, licensure, whatever it is. So they have put together a recommendation on the recognition of refugees' qualifications called the European Qualifications Passport for Refugees and the Toolkit for Recognition of Refugees' Qualifications. Both of these things, especially the Toolkit for Recognition, is a really valuable sort of hands-on, step-by-step process. Do you want to pause for questions here? And what I've done just in these last few slides is kind of synthesize all of these. There's a lot of common themes throughout these steps to recognition. So I've kind of synthesized a little bit the steps from each of them into 5.
Okay.
What do you think?
Why don't you finish up, and then we'll take questions, and people are welcome to stay, and we'll just get all the questions answered if we go over a little bit.
That's
okay.
Fine. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. Okay. So first, assess what documents are needed, what are missing. Sort of look at the big picture. What do you need to make your decision? What does the student have? And what are the circumstances that prevent the individual from securing their academic documents? Reconstruct. So this could be through an interview, obtaining a written timeline, including places, names, dates, anything that they can remember, and then requesting any and all available documentation, even if it's incomplete or unofficial, like I did for this Eritrean student. And this could be, get creative. It could be, student ID. It could be, a license or a certificate of achievement, or even if it's not, it could be something that proves that they, were where they said they were and got the credential they said they got. So it doesn't always have to be sort of that traditional looking document. And then research, and this is, I think, where, this is kind of my bread and butter, but, I think everybody should do it, is to determine whether information can be gotten from other sources. You'd be so surprised. I also recently verified an Iraqi document from 2013 for a university graduate by going onto the Wayback Machine. Has anybody heard of this? It's like the Internet Archive. So a university in Iraq had a list of graduates for each year. They like published the graduation list. And so I was able to go back to a previously saved version of the website in 2013 and find the student on the graduation list, you know, proof that
Super clever.
Right. News articles, LinkedIn, right? If somebody's a professional or has a qualification and you know, was a vet in Venezuela, like, you know, what if they have a LinkedIn, you know, or a scholarly publication? Colleagues, credential evaluation professionals, you know, if you're at an institution and you have a library of previous academic credentials that you've received, go back and see, have you, like I did with the Iraqi secondary student, does it look like it's supposed to? You know, like you use other resources to see what you have. And then evaluate. So there are other ways to determine someone's preparedness for further education or a job. There might be exams or placement tests, skills assessment, interviews, etc. And then finally, make a determination to the best of your ability. Ultimately, you know, are they eligible for your program or your job? Are they likely to succeed? And I think that's a big one because, you know, I think it's important to remember that we all, you know, you want to set a student up for success, not for failure. And then what additional support might be needed. So you can use these to make your own policies and procedures if you haven't already. And then I won't read this quote, but it's a good one. You can read it on your own. This is sort of from Enoch and Eric, and essentially it's saying that everyone, regardless of their situation, should have the right to have their qualifications assessed by a responsible authority. So.
Thank you, Karin. That's really wonderful.
I'll leave this one up, or you'll have the slides
Yeah.
so that you can contact me later. But yeah, let's try to squeeze in a few questions. I'm sorry.
Yeah. No, it's this is what I was hoping for. Really rich, lots of good information. Why don't I just let me just, before we get started with questions, let me just make an announcement, and then what we'll do is I think that our questions will probably go beyond the 4 o'clock hour, which is fine. I think we'll just stay here until we're done, and if people need to leave at the 4 o'clock hour, that's fine too. But just let me announce that our final webinar coming up as part of this series, Sarah Feinsilver, Kevin Foley, and Mariam Ali from Madison College are going to be hosting a panel of panel discussion of students with refugee background. And so there's going to be, we're going to learn about their experiences. That we're really looking forward to that. I put the flyer in the chat before. That's Tuesday, May 25th, 3 to 4 p.m. Central Standard Time, and all the information's there. I also, you know, these slides and the video will be up online, and I will be getting out an email with that for everyone who registered. So those are just the announcements. Becca, do you want to take us through some questions?
Sure. So Bethany has another question. What kind of outreach does your organization do to inform immigrants and refugees about getting their credentials reviewed to avoid additional years of schooling and payments?
Well, that's a really good question. You know, I work closely with Madison College, with the Literacy Network, and other organizations in town. I work with, and not just in Madison or in Wisconsin, I work with, you know, higher education institutions all over the United States, and also licensing boards and for various purposes. But you know, it's actually something that I need to do more and would like to do more is to find out how to reach out to those service organizations and those institutions that need this type of service. I've worked closely with Forward Services Corporation here in Madison too, who you know, to work with refugees. But I think it's more that they found me. So I haven't necessarily made a concerted effort to reach out, but I would very much like to help.
There's a national organization of credential evaluators that they must have an advocacy
There's a
kind of
few
agenda are?
organizations. Yeah, there's
Yeah.
several organizations. The one that I'm involved in is called TISEP. It's the Association for Credential Evaluation Professionals. And it's for not just US credential evaluators, but it's all of the, ENIC NARICs in Europe and South Africa qualifications and all over the world. So it's a global network. Yeah, so.
Okay.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Bintu Suso has asked, is there a government agency involved in vetting evaluation companies and making sure evaluations are consistent across the board?
There's not in the US. There's no accreditation for evaluation agencies. It's just professional organizations that evaluation agencies are members of. And these professional organizations set the standard for methodology, and there are resources that that sort of across the board credential evaluators use that have been researched very thoroughly and that are kind of the standard for evaluation. So, for instance, ACRO is the American Association of Collegiate Registrars and Admission Offices, and there's a database that they have called EDGE, and many evaluators sort of use this as a resource to determine grading scales and those benchmark credentials. So, yeah, I guess the short answer is no, there's not in the US, not like other countries.
These associations have a code of ethics as well that sort of relates to these like professional ethics and so on.
Yeah. But evaluators within the same organization or the same, professional organization may arrive at different conclusions. So, it's still up to the judgment of the evaluation agency to set their own policies, similar to, how institutions and admission offices work autonomously, right? Like each university has the right to make their own decision, for an applicant, even though they follow certain guidelines and have,
Right.
But there's a code of ethics, and there's professional, obviously, conferences. That TISEP has a certificate program for credential evaluators to prove competency in sort of basic credential evaluation methodologies, and then secondary and post-secondary and other systems. And so that's sort of the first credentialing for credential evaluators that exists. But yeah.
Great. Christina Smith asks, how successful have the use of affidavits been?
Well, I don't know, because that usually happens. Once I create the report and have conversations with the school, I don't always know what happens then, because ultimately the decision rests with them. So whether they decide to admit the student, whether the student has been successful, it's not often, unless somebody comes back and tells me or I follow up, I don't know what the decision always is. So, as I said, my job is kind of an advisory one. I hand the information off, and, I hope that the best decision or the best informed decision is made. But I don't always know. But I think anecdotally and sort of in, with the programs that have, especially the ones in Europe that have, that are much more established and have been tremendously successful, I think the affidavits and the interviews have been essential in making those determinations. And they've been a really important part of the process. So I think that should be encouraged here as well. And I hope it is.
And our last question so far, Salvador Carranza is asking, many universities are now awarding credits for life experiences. How do you evaluate that?
And again, I don't. I leave that up to the university to determine, how they would do that. So I only evaluate academic credentials. So I don't evaluate life experience or work experience. If someone has a vocational qualification or a license, I'll indicate that on the evaluation report. But, really the work I do is very sort of quantitative. It's qualitative and quantitative, but it's, the student has X number of years of education. This is the benchmark credential. This is the GPA, and then the supporting documents, those things that sort of round out the person and help those that are making the decisions make the decisions. That's something that they have to take into consideration. So I don't, but again, it should be taken into consideration that others should ask for those type of things and make a holistic kind of decision.
It reminds me of like required internships or practicums, nursing, education, maybe engineering. How do you handle those kinds of if they're required by a program? How do you handle those
They're
kinds of
usually
things?
listed as such on the transcript, so that's pretty common. That will be like related learning hours or like a practicum or thesis or internship, and usually they have it's usually listed sort of as pass fail, and then sometimes it will just be kind of a chunk of education that's listed like this was part of the requirements, and sometimes it will be actually credited. So it might either be listed in like hours, like in the Philippines usually for nursing, like related nursing hours might be like 240 hours versus like 5 hours for like a math class and a thesis or something. So it depends on how the home country and home institution qualifies it, right, or quantifies it. If they list it as part of the academic requirements for graduation and give it a grade and a credit weight, or if it's just part of the requirements for graduation and not really quantified much on the transcript. So it really depends on the country, the level, the program, even the time frame. Like something 20 years ago versus something last year might look really different. So each time you evaluate, you sort of have to look at the document with fresh eyes and make those judgments each time and do the research.
Mm-hmm.
research. It's like putting puzzles together, right? Like you said before, it's like that's why my logo is a puzzle piece. It's like it really is like putting together a puzzle, and it's satisfying because you see these pieces and then it creates a whole picture, sort of a whole image of that person's academic history, or that's the goal anyway.
Yeah. Is there anything else, Becca?
Yeah, one more question from Christina.
Okay,
have there been any schools in particular you've found to be more sympathetic to refugee circumstances when it comes to documentation?
Community colleges. I think, just in general, it's a good and a safe place for a lot of students to start who are starting out. I think that there's, and it's not to say that others aren't. I think just in my personal experience, that's the route that most students have taken. I think that they can be a little bit more flexible and more supportive for students. And again, I'm not throwing any other universities under the bus. I just anecdotally, I think that it's just a good place for students to start. They usually have the resources to have some flexible hours. It's usually less expensive and just a good transition into the education in the US. So that's just been sort of anecdotally anyone that I know of. And again, like I said, I'm sure many students that fall under this large category that I don't know that they are, because they don't disclose that to me what their immigration status is. But for those that I know are sort of starting out or are having issues with documentation, it's been through the community college network.
This has been so informative and really wonderful. I was just thinking, when you were making the case for the importance of this kind of work, the financial consequences, the consequences to people being able to achieve their goals and support themselves. And it's also like the emotional kind of blow of like, imaginary a degree, while you're being displaced, and then, being told that it didn't translate, or it didn't come, you couldn't use that. That's sort of that emotional setback is something there as well. So like the work that you're doing to support people in this journey is very impactful, I think. And really appreciate you telling us, educating on, this area of work and of research. It's so fascinating. And so really thank you for educating us and for your time. This has been really wonderful.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So once again, everyone, thanks for sticking on a little bit longer so we could get all the questions answered. You know, shortly I'll have the video and these slides with all the links for these really great resources as well. So thanks very much, everyone. I'm going to off the recorder now. Actually, Becca, how do I off the recorder?
I think
Oh,
Here's the,
I can press recording.
I see it now.